He was the first male royal consort since Geoffrey Plantagenet over 400 years earlier, and like Geoffrey, Lord Guildford Dudley is seen by many as not being a true royal consort. His wife, Lady Jane Grey, did not go through with a coronation, much the same as Geoffrey's wife, the Empress Matilda, in the 12th century. And yet, both Matilda and Jane were acknowledged as queens for a time, and thus their husbands should be recognised as royal consorts. Guildford was therefore only the second man to have such a claim in English history, and yet his story remains significantly less covered than his far more famous wife. Born the fourth son of the mighty John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, he was a member of the nobility, but being the fourth son was by no means deemed particularly significant. That is, until his marriage to the girl who would go on to become England's shortest reigning monarch. So, who was Guildford Dudley? What was his early life like? And is there any truth in the theory that he and Jane Grey absolutely hated each other? Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 98, Lord Guildford Dudley, the first Tudor male consort. Lord Guildford Dudley was the second youngest surviving son of John Dudley, later known as the Duke of Northumberland, and his wife Jane Guildford. We know the order in which the Dudley children were born, but like most other noble children of the time, a recorded date of birth for Guildford is not known, although 1536 or early 1537 appears the most logical. And that he was also likely born in London, as his mother was serving Henry VIII's third queen, Jane Seymour. The 13 Dudley children grew up in a Protestant household and received a humanist education. Under the young King Edward VI, Guildford's father became Lord President of the Council and de facto ruled England from 1550 to 1553, having successfully overthrown the King's uncle, Edward Seymour. The chronicler Richard Grafton, who knew him, described Guildford as a comely, virtuous and goodly gentleman. In 1552, his father, the Duke of Northumberland, unsuccessfully tried to arrange a marriage between Guildford and Margaret Clifford, a granddaughter of Princess Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, thus making Margaret a grandniece of the former king. Northumberland being unsuccessful actually ended up being a silver lining, or at least it was thought so at the time, for Northumberland instead secured Lady Jane Grey for his son, who, as the daughter of Princess Mary's elder daughter, was more senior in the line of succession, placing fourth to Margaret's eighth. On the 25th of May 1553, 3 weddings were celebrated at Durham Place, the Duke of Northumberland's London mansion. Guildford married Jane, his sister Catherine married Henry Hastings, the heir of the Earl of Huntingdon, who was himself a potential claimant to the throne, being the great-great-grandson of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of Kings Edward IV and Richard III, and finally Jane's sister Catherine married Lord Herbert, the heir of the Earl of Pembroke. The day was described as a magnificent festival with jousts, games and masks. For the latter, 2 different companies had been booked, one male, one female. The Venetian and French ambassadors were guests at the triple wedding, and there were a large number of the common people and of the most principal of the realm. The celebrations were, however, marred when, late into the evening, several guests, including Guildford himself, suffered an attack of food poisoning because of a mistake made by a cook who plucked one leaf for another. It's comical to consider that even then, in the era of the Tudors, a wedding was upset by a bad case of the shits. We do not know exactly what Guildford or Jane felt about their union, about their wedding. However, it is safe to say that at the beginning it would have definitely been more pleasing for Guildford than it was for Jane, simply because of the major disparity in their respective ranks. Guildford was a nobleman, but by no means a senior one, and as the fourth-born son was extremely unlikely to inherit titles or estates once his father died. By contrast, Jane was the heir apparent to the Duke of Suffolk, for she had no brothers, and was a great-granddaughter of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Jane would have grown up expecting the very greatest marriage prospects, not least of which for a time was believed to be her cousin, King Edward VI. Guildford was essentially a consolation prize. The imperial ambassador to the English court reported that Guildford and Jane would not immediately consummate their marriage because of the young age of both parties. For much of June, Guildford and Jane appear to have lived apart, visiting and building their relationship step by step. By the time that Jane was proclaimed queen, the couple were living in Durham Place and were now sleeping together. In early 1553, it was becoming increasingly clear that King Edward VI was not going to have a long life. He was repeatedly ill, and naturally buzzards began circulating to discuss who would be his successor. For the common people, there was only one answer: the king's elder sister, Princess Mary. But famously, brother and sister had greatly opposing religious views, with Edward a committed Protestant and Mary a voracious Catholic. Edward was terrified of Mary taking his kingdom back to the old ways, with England under the charge of the Pope, and thus he, along with his advisers, notably Northumberland, created Edward's device of the succession. The crux of the document was simple. Both Edward's sisters were removed, ostensibly for their status as illegitimate, although this is likely a smokescreen used to cover away why Mary would be cut out but not Elizabeth, and instead settled the crown on his cousin, Lady Jane Grey. Northumberland's hands in the specifics of the device are clear, for under strict primogeniture, it should have been Jane's mother, Frances Brandon, who was named heir, for she was more senior in the traditional line of succession, but she was not married to Northumberland's son, but Jane was. With that said, the initial device stated that the throne would pass to the sons of Lady Jane Grey, not Jane herself. But it became clear to Edward that he did not have the time for sons to be born to Jane Grey in what time he had left of life, and so he added 2 words into the device, changing it from the Lady Jane's heirs male to the Lady Jane and her heirs male. Those 2 small words, and her, changed everything and set the seal on Jane Grey being Edward's nominated heir. After Edward's death on the 6th of July 1553, the Duke of Northumberland undertook the enforcement of the king's will. Having previously served as Lord Admiral, Northumberland understood well the importance of the navy and how ships would and could disseminate both information and enforcement across the country. One such ship was called the Greyhound, which, according to a commentator hostile to John Dudley, travelled out in the company of 5 others of the king's ships, traitorously sent forth by the late Duke of Northumberland to obtain his wicked and devilish purpose against the Queen's Majesty, meaning Mary I. The ship's captain, Gilbert Grice, described as a servant to the same Duke and a man by him specially put in trust for the furtherance of his devilish purpose, went on board another boat, the Hart, and there consulted with the other captains of the royal fleet. When Grice returned on board the Greyhound, he was asked by the ship's master, John Hurlock, what news and whether the king were alive. Grice replied that King Edward was dead, but praised be God, as he declared, the realm had another king, being the Duke his lord and master's son, the Lord Guildford, who was married unto the Duke of Suffolk's daughter, then also queen. The envoys of the Holy Roman Empire and France were sure that Dudley's plan to place Jane on the throne would succeed, with Princess Mary being told her case was hopeless and that she should flee England. Jane was reluctant to accept the crown. She gave in after remonstrances by an assembly of nobles, including her parents and her in-laws, while Guildford chimed in with a more friendly approach, talking to Jane and convincing her with prayers and caresses, whatever that means. On the 10th of July 1553, Lady Jane Grey was officially proclaimed Queen. The people of London were dumbfounded and outwardly called to see their true queen, as they saw it, Mary, succeeding to her late brother's rule. On the very same day as Jane's proclamation, a letter from Mary Tudor arrived in London, saying that she was now queen and demanding the obedience of the council. Jane and Guildford made their ceremonial entry into the Tower of London. It was said that Jane Grey was so small that she was required to wear shoppings, a sort of 16th century platform shoe, to give her added height. After the royal party had settled into the tower, the Marquis of Winchester arrived with St Edward's crown and asked Jane to try it on, with Jane later stating that I might put it on my head in order to prove whether it stayed on me well. The Marquis then said that there was a crown for Guildford too, or that one could be commissioned. Jane commented, "The which words I heard with great dislike to me." It was when Winchester had left the room that the now infamous exchange occurred between Jane, Guildford and her in-laws. We know of the exchange, for Jane later recalled it during her interrogations after being ousted from the throne. Jane stated, "I was with my husband, and of that I discussed with him much, that I reduced him to consent that, if he must be made king, it should be done by me and by way of the Parliament. Afterwards I commanded to be called the Earl of Arundel and the Earl of Pembroke, and I told them that, when the crown came to me, it was resolved by me not to wish to make my husband king, nor ever to consent to it, but that it contented me to make him a duke. The which being related to his mother, she angered herself with me in every way, and persuaded her son that he should not sleep with me any more, the which he obeyed, declaring to me that he did not desire to be a duke, but king." The dukedom that Jane decided on was that of the Duke of Clarence, the title held by the aforementioned George, brother of Edward IV and Richard III. The Duke of Northumberland was, at this point, still in the capital gathering troops to march against Mary Tudor, who was putting up an unexpected resistance in East Anglia. When Mary's letter of defiance had arrived in London, the Duchesses of Suffolk and Northumberland were both said to burst into tears. It was especially difficult for the Duchess of Suffolk, Jane's mother, for she and Mary were cousins and were for a time very close. Both the Duchesses clearly realised just how dangerous their position now was, perhaps more acutely than either of their respective husbands. And so, despite her fury at her son not being made king, the Duchess of Northumberland now commanded Guildford to leave the tower and go home to safety, accurately guessing the way in which the wind was blowing and that Jane would not rule for long. Jane, however, pulled rank and insisted that Guildford remained at court by her side. She may have been young and in over her head, but Jane was the proclaimed queen, and her words carried more weight than her mother-in-law. Initially, it was Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, who was asked to go out and meet Mary's army head-on, but Jane stepped in again and blocked this happening, instead sending her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, who marched to Cambridge with his troops and passed a week that saw no action until he heard on the 20th of July that the council in London had declared for Mary. Northumberland proclaimed Mary Tudor himself at the marketplace in Cambridge and was arrested the next morning. Northumberland sensed the council's treachery and, exhorting them to stay loyal to Jane, expressed his doubts, which his double-tongued colleagues tried to allay with assurances of them all being in the same boat. However much Jane may have opposed her spouse's pretensions, she did embrace her married status, and any ill feelings were gone when, in the last days of her reign, she agreed to act as godmother to the newborn son of Edward Underhill, a soldier at the Tower who had refused to march with the Duke of Northumberland. Queen Jane named my son Guildford after her husband, according to Edward. Guildford Underhill's baptism on the 19th of July would turn out to be the very last thing that Jane would do under her tenure as Queen. On that same afternoon, Queen Mary was proclaimed in London, and the Duke of Suffolk, Jane's father, personally tore down her state canopy at the Tower. He and his wife then managed to get out of the fortress, accompanied by some of the ladies-in-waiting, but, as the imperial ambassadors gleefully related 3 days later, not everybody was so lucky. It was stated, "The Duchess of Northumberland, Guildford, her son, and the Lady Jane of Suffolk are detained in the Tower as prisoners and receive sour treatment, somewhat different from that meted out to them during their 8 days' reign." Not sure where the 8 days' reign aspects comes in, but that's what the record says. Guildford tried to induce his wife to cede her right to the crown to him, so that he might not only be consort and administrator, but king in person, intending to have himself confirmed as such by Parliament. but she refused to do so and gave him the title of Duke of Clarence, which is reserved for the younger son of the king. According to further remarks by the imperial ambassadors, the daily council meetings that took place over the 13 days, and yes, it is 13 days, I'll come on to explain why, reign of Queen Jane, was actually presided over by Guildford and not Jane, who also allegedly dined in state alone and had himself addressed in regal style as either Your Grace or Your Excellency. Antoine de Nolay, the French ambassador, described Guildford as the new king, and the imperial court in Brussels also believed in the existence of King Guildford. A majority of the Privy Council moved out of the Tower before switching their allegiances across to Queen Mary I. Becoming aware of his colleague's change of mind, Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, abandoned his command of the fortress and proclaimed Mary as Queen on nearby Tower Hill. After he had left, his wife was told that she could also go home, while, as stated above, Jane, Guildford and the Duchess of Northumberland were to remain inside the Tower. Jane was later moved from the royal apartments to the gentleman jailers' lodgings, and Guildford was imprisoned in the Bell Tower. There he was soon joined by his brother, Robert, the man who would go on to become the great favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. Guildford's remaining brothers were imprisoned in other parts of the Tower. So, a question we should ask is, did Guildford Dudley actually conduct and act in a way commensurate with a king consort? Did he genuinely demand to be named king? And should the sources reporting on the brief reign of Jane Grey be totally trusted? What is undeniable is that the reports were generally produced by people towards Jane and more accurately John Dudley, and thus more favourable towards Queen Mary I. Even so, there is no smoke without fire, and the response to Guildford not being made king from both his family and later commentators is ultimately driven from the fact that the prospect of a female sovereign existed in theory, but should be avoided at all costs, and as women were deemed inferior to men at the time, it was naturally assumed that a queen's husband would at least share in some of that power, if not control more of it than the queen directly. Queen's consort had huge power, but not nearly as much as the actual, up until this point, entirely male sovereigns. It would thus have been perfectly normal for Guildford to expect to be made king of some sort. When the French ambassador informed Henry II of France of Edward VI's death, he actually wrote of Le Nouveau Roi, the new king, apparently referring to Guildford. The Habsburg court of Brussels also believed in the reality of King Guildford. When the Spanish diplomat Diego de Mendoza heard the news, he was quick to express his delight to the English ambassadors. I was his godfather, and would as willingly spend my blood in his service as any servant he hath. And so, although we now see Jane not willingly making her husband king as entirely appropriate, for he didn't have any claim to the throne in the way that she did, it was seen as very unusual to those at the time. Even so, once Jane had made it clear that she would want to reign alone, no further attempts were made by Guildford or the Duke of Northumberland to make the former king consort. Something else that we should also explore is that it was really the Grey family who were the principal beneficiaries of Edward VI's device for the succession, not the House of Dudley. Edward's device stated that if Jane and Guildford only had daughters, that Jane's sister Catherine was to inherit the crown after her. If Guildford died young, Jane could take another husband. If Jane died young without leaving a son, Guildford would lose his position of influence. In short, there was essentially no great benefit for the Dudleys, save proximity to the crown and the possibility, and it was only that, a possibility, of a son being born to Jane and Guildford, which, if Jane kept her crown, which was a big if, would then succeed her, making a possible future king half a Dudley. To this end, it could be argued that it was natural for the Duke of Northumberland to expect at least the title of a king for his son in return. We now know with hindsight, however, that by marrying his son to an heir to the throne, John Dudley had inadvertently placed a major price on Guildford's head. Excuse the pun. After Mary's victory, only 3 people were executed for the plot against her succession, chief among them, of course, being John Dudley himself. Jane and Guildford were indicted on the 12th of August, and Jane submitted a letter of explanation to the Queen, asking forgiveness for the sin she was accused of, informing Her Majesty about the truth of events. In this account, she spoke of herself as a wife who loves her husband. Queen Mary was prepared to spare Jane and Guildford's lives, concluding that they were mere pawns in Northumberland's scheme. Northumberland died in the hope that his sons would be spared, and indeed the imperial ambassadors soon believed that that would be the outcome, and that Lady Jane could certainly expect to be pardoned. However, other than their parents, all of the young people remained in prison and had to stand trial at some point. Jane and Guildford Dudley's turn came on the 13th of November 1553, when they were led on foot from the Tower to the Guildhall with their co-accused, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and Guildford's brothers Ambrose and Henry. Very little is known of Guildford's physical appearance, for no contemporary portrait or sketch of him exists, and only one, probably made-up description of his appearance has ever been produced, in which he is described as a very tall, strong boy with light hair. That is literally all we have to work with. We do have a record of what Guildford wore to his trial, which is said to be a black velvet suit slashed with white satin. When it came to Guildford's trial in particular, crucially, he was not accused of having tried to usurp the crown or of assuming titles to which he had no right. His crime had been to depose Queen Mary by sending troops to his father and the receiving, honouring and proclaiming of his wife as Queen. Jane's own treason consisted in having signed certain documents as Jane the Queen. A few of these papers have survived, for example an order on the 18th of July to raise troops to be sent into the rebellious county of Buckinghamshire. We cannot know whether Guildford had something to do with the dispatch of such business, but it seems unlikely. Not only did he not sign anything, but his father, his uncle and all of his brothers were away in the field, and the Dudley influence in the Privy Council was by now swiftly on the decline. It was, after all, just the day before they proclaimed for Mary. At the conclusion of the trial, both Jane and Guildford were found guilty, with Jane sentenced to be burned at the stake or beheaded, and Guildford to be hung, drawn and quartered, or, should the Queen allow, to also be beheaded. Having pleaded guilty, the outcome was a foregone conclusion, for no one could refute that Jane and Guildford had done exactly as the charges had laid out. But, as referenced earlier, it was expected that both would soon receive a reprieve from the Queen. Even so, both Jane and Guildford were returned to the Tower of London, the axe now facing towards them, a clear sign to the people of London that the couple had been found guilty and sentenced to death. In December, Jane was allowed to walk freely in the Queen's garden, itself a sign that she was being given more freedom than your typical convicted traitor, whilst Guildford and his brother Robert were given leave to go up onto the walkways of the bell tower. Despite her personal popularity, Queen Mary I's plans to marry King Philip of Naples and Sicily, the future Philip II of Spain, was greeted with widespread opposition, not just among the populace, but also among members of Parliament and Privy Councillors. It was this that would have devastating consequences for both Jane and Guildford. For in 1554, in response to the proposed marriage, Thomas Wyatt, a son of the Thomas Wyatt who had famously courted Anne Boleyn, led a rebellion against Mary, with the aim of displacing her and putting her half-sister Elizabeth on the throne in her place. As such, Wyatt's rebellion did not have Jane Grey at its core. However, in what would be a colossal error, Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, took part in the rebellion. This was the final straw for Jane, and by extension Guildford, with Mary's government now pushing her to proceed with the young couple's executions. It was said that it troubled Mary to let her cousin die, but she accepted the Privy Council's advice. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, the prick, I can't stand the man, pressed for the young couple's execution in a court sermon, and the Imperial Ambassador Simon Reynard was happy to report that Jane of Suffolk and her husband are to lose their heads. We have only one short example of Guildford's writing, which was found in one of Jane's own prayer books, although the letter is actually written to Jane's father and is a short farewell, having been made aware that his execution was soon to be going ahead. He wrote to Henry Grey, saying, "Your loving and obedient son wishes unto your grace long life in this world, with as much joy and comfort as ever I wish to myself, and in the world to come joy everlasting. Your humble son, to his death, G. Dudley." The day before their executions, Guildford asked Jane for a meeting, which she refused, explaining that it would only increase their misery and pain. It was better to put it off, as they would meet shortly elsewhere and live bound by indissoluble ties. Around 10 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of February, Guildford was led towards Tower Hill, where many gentlemen waited to shake his hands. His execution had, mercifully, been commuted to a simple beheading. He made a short speech to the assembled crowd, as was customary. Having no ghostly father with him, he knelt, prayed, and asked the people to pray for him, holding up his eyes and hands to God many times. He was killed with one strike of the axe, after which his body was conveyed on a cart to the Tower Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where his remains are still held to this day. Watching the scene from her window, Jane exclaimed, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford." He was buried in the chapel with Jane, who was dead within the hour. The executions did not contribute to Mary's or her government's popularity. 5 months after the couple's death, John Foxe, the famous Scottish reformer, wrote of them as innocents, such as by just laws and faithful witnesses can never be proved to have offended by themselves. Of Guildford, the chronicler Grafton wrote 10 years later, "Even those that never before the time of his execution saw him, did with lamentable tears bewail his death." 500 years later, Jane and Guildford's deaths remain deeply shocking, not only for the couple's significant youth at the time of their executions, but because they were ultimately pawns moved around a chessboard by powerful figures, controlling their every move like puppet masters. That Mary proceeded with the executions is seen as a major blot on her already shaky reputation, but equally, it could be argued that she was acting in complete accordance with the time. Although many will claim that she wouldn't have ever actually gone ahead with executing her sister Elizabeth, the fact that she did eventually agree to Jane's death tells us that Mary was not above killing those with close blood bonds, even though it was said to greatly upset her. Guildford in particular feels like a totally wasted life, I suppose. Dying at roughly the age of just 17, a point in which his life was just beginning, really, and yet his life was snuffed out with the swing of an axe, essentially for doing nothing more than agreeing to marry a girl of royal blood, unaware at the time that this would eventually be his undoing. Much is made about how Jane and Guildford supposedly disliked each other, but this has a basis more in Jane refusing to make Guildford king than any hard evidence. I would say the evidence points to the opposite, and that by the time of their deaths, Jane and Guildford had grown very fond of each other. The fact that Guildford had wanted to see Jane, and that she in turn suggested that it would be too upsetting, I think is really telling. It's clear that they'd become close, and obviously it's impossible to say if they were genuinely in love. But that, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford," that Jane said as she watched his corpse pass under her cell window certainly tells us just how sad Jane was. Very little is known of Guildford's life, from his exact age to what he looked like, but it is clear that his life did not need to end in the way that it did. Jane Grey may have only reigned for 13 days. Yes, it's 13, not 9, and the reason for that is that there is never not a king or queen in England and Great Britain. And so when Edward VI died, on the 6th of July, Jane, as his nominated heir, became queen. And so her reign started on the 6th of July, not the 10th of July. The 10th of July is the day that it was proclaimed, and it ended on the 19th. That's where you get the 9 days. But accurately speaking, she reigned for 13 days. And during that time, she was proclaimed and reigned as a queen. And thus Guildford is, and was, a royal consort. Philip of Spain, Mary I's husband, is often seen as the first king consort in England. And it is true that he was the first person to officially be given that title. But as far as I'm concerned, he was not the first Tudor male royal consort. That title belongs firmly to Guildford Dudley, husband of, as I believe she should be called, Queen Jane I. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Over the next few weeks, I'll be welcoming some new faces onto the podcast, as well as former guests, covering some of the most fascinating figures, not only from Tudor England, but from around the world, including a very in-depth look at how female rule has helped shape the world as we know it. Make sure to keep up to date with all things Tudor Chest by giving me a follow on Instagram. And if you like listening to the Tudor Chest podcast, then perhaps you would consider becoming an official patron or subscriber, where you can access my weekly subscriber only episodes. They can be found via Patreon or Apple Podcasts. Just search for The Tudor Chest. Thank you again, and speak soon.